One of the main reasons why I want to basically protect depositors is to make sure we don't have runs on other banks.
So one possibility.
Well, none of us wants that, Vivek.
Megyn, I don't want to step on you, Megyn, but one possibility I just want to recognize immediately in the back of what David just said is consider the possibility. I don't think it's a wild possibility. I think it's part of what happened. That Silicon Valley Bank and a lot of its egregious risk management practices, et cetera, were in part created by a culture in which we bail out banks. Now, this time we didn't bail out the banks. We bailed out the depositors, who are a bunch of tech startups that put money, in my opinion, too much money without diversifying in Silicon Valley Bank. What do is we create the incentives for that same thing to happen again. And so in a certain way, it is important to figure out how do we actually solve for what comes after Silicon Valley Bank. But the precedents we set here affect what happened in the future. In fact, that's exactly what we saw on display here. And that's also why I separate this idea of how we should have handled Silicon Valley Bank. I believe that its depositors should have been held to account for the risks that they took, and their investors, these are many venture-backed startups, could have put in more money to cover the hole if needed. That's painful for them. They make less money, but this isn't about the workers. Handle Silicon Valley Bank that way, and then prospectively, in advance, not retroactively changing the rules after the fact, but prospectively in advance, change the rules of the road for everyone else to prevent a run on the bank, which no one wants in this country.
But let me ask you this, Vivek. What about David's point of distinguishing the depositors? Like the investors, that's one thing. I think most of us can say they're screwed. They failed to assess the proper risk. No one's going to cry a tear when it went down for them. And certainly nobody has any sympathy for the management team, most of us don't, at SVB. However, the depositors, can you speak to his point of like, most of us, we've put the money in there, these small business owners, they're not looking at the balance sheet of Silicon Valley Bank. And it's like just kind of the bank that you were supposed to go to in tech. A lot of these VC firms, as I understand it, insisted that you bank with SVB. So they did. Like, what about those people who are not really trying to assume risk? They're just trying to park their money someplace.
Look, I think it is fundamentally unjust for multi-billion-dollar companies that parked 8- and 9-figure sums at Silicon Valley Bank, whose CFOs, some of which did not even know what the deposit insurance maximum was. That's part of a culture of excess in Silicon Valley created by, among other things, 10, 15 years of easy money raining from on high like manna from heaven from the Federal Reserve. Now that we're actually seeing the disciplining process, this is part of that disciplining, Megyn. And I know this characterization of small business, I know that's the focus group lexicon we're using now, but these are people who put together business plans to create trillion-dollar companies, become billionaires themselves, had upside skew, had special deals with Silicon Valley Bank to avoid dilution in their companies. But those special deals required them to put that money into Silicon Valley Bank implicitly or explicitly. These are conscious decisions that allowed people to enjoy potentially outsized upside for themselves, including companies in David's portfolio, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, when the risk went south, we're recharacterizing them as sort of sympathetic, innocent people who didn't do their due diligence. I'm not saying they should be punished. I'm not saying that they're doing criminal prosecution. All I'm saying is play by the same rules of the road that you played when entering. And if you don't, the next time Roku or the equivalent of them or other multi-billion-dollar companies that parked hundreds of millions of dollars in, that's a cardinal sin. That's a risk management failure. And what are we saying now? The public is still going to come in and save you for making those bad decisions. What should you expect in the future? More of the same yet again. That's what we're emphasizing. But if this had been a different part of the economy, this is why I think the Silicon Valley Bank story is important. I think if it had gone in a different order, if it had been a smaller regional bank, I think we would be having a very different conversation publicly in this country because there wouldn't be influential people like David, like Mark Cuban, et cetera, having driven a dialogue to make this a concern about a national bank run, when in fact it was in part all of those people have vested interests, and it's not a slight. It's just a fact. People need to evaluate this.
But before I give it back to David, how do you say it's like this risk that they're overplaying of a bank run? But speak to David's point about what's happening with Charles Schwab today and these 6 other regional banks and the failure of this New York bank that we mentioned. Like there has been some evidence on his side that this could get a lot worse, a lot faster.
Yeah, so I'm actually not denying that. You see my Wall Street Journal op-ed. What I do is I draw the distinction between how you treat Silicon Valley Bank and then prospectively how you actually prevent that bank run. I think the Federal Reserve needs to play its role as the lender of last resort. This is one of the main reasons why the Federal Reserve exists. I think prospectively, in the short run, even temporarily, overshoot on what you need the FDIC insured maximum to be in the short run. You play it strong. That's how you actually prevent a bank run in the future. So I've advocated these policies. I think those banks also need to raise deposit rates to incentivize people to keep the money actually, as opposed to pursuing a bank run. So my piece in the Journal today lays out a lot of that. So I'm not denying the importance. None of us here wants a bank run in America. But the weird thing that happened over the weekend is the people who were tethered to Silicon Valley Bank's fate and the depositors and the startups that had actually parked money there had a weird incentive to actually create a great fear about a bank run in America, because that justified exactly what happened on Sunday evening when those tech startups effectively got bailed out by the government, which, by the way, and I want David to respond to this, for years, and I assume David and I are on the same side of this. We generally favor deregulation, but for years, Silicon Valley Bank has lobbied and has explicitly made the case that it would not be systemically important, that the government would not need to touch it. And yet, when their hour of need, in Silicon Valley's broad hour of need, what happens? The government comes in, and the very people who made that argument 3 years ago are now talking out of the other side of their mouth. It's not right.
Okay, let him respond.
I never made
that
respond. Argument. I don't even know what you're talking about. If Gary Becker made that argument, fine. He's disgraced and he's going to lose all his stock options and his company's bankrupt. What we're talking about is the depositors here. Now, let me go back to this point of moral hazard. I think we need to dispense with this. The way you solve moral hazard is by wiping out the stockholders, the bondholders, and the employee stock options. And Gary Becker's going to be in litigation for years. We didn't do that in 2008. That was
Becker.
A huge problem with what we did in 2008 is we didn't wipe out those stockholders. That was wrong. But here we are, and this is different. And it is not a bailout of those stockholders. What we are doing here is protecting deposits. And if there is a shortfall, it is not going to be paid for by the taxpayer. It is being paid for out of insurance premiums paid by other banks. I think that is right, good, and appropriate. And if you send the message across this country right now, in the middle of a banking crisis, that deposits are not safe, watch out, we are going to have those Jimmy Stewart runs on the bank. This is where I find Vivek's position completely irresponsible. And I have to say, the reason why we got into such a scrap on Twitter is he was maintaining this nonsense that somehow VCs like me on Twitter who are simply noticing the problem were somehow responsible for the problem. This is a left-wing tactic where when you notice what the government has done wrong and you point it out, that somehow you're blamed for it. Listen, it was basically the Fed and the Biden administration who created this unprecedented inflation. They basically overheated the economy and then they slammed on the brakes and created all these toxic assets at all of these banks, not just SVB, but across the country. I noticed that. I pointed it out. I didn't even tweet, actually, until SVB was already in receivership and the run on Signature Bank had already started. So this idea that VCs could have anything to do with it, I think is ridiculous. What we were doing is noticing that, hey, we have a huge problem here. We need to jump on this. And I basically tweeted out, where is Yellen? Where is Powell? Where is Biden? They didn't say anything on Friday. They didn't say anything on Saturday. Then finally on Sunday morning, Powell goes, or Yellen goes on the Sunday shows. And she basically gives this wishy-washy statement that didn't inspire anyone's confidence. And you could feel the lack of confidence and the panic growing by the hour, because I talked to many, many business leaders, and they were extremely worried that at the Monday morning open of this stock market, we were going to see a panic like you've never seen before. And then finally, they did the right thing on Sunday night by basically protecting deposits, and they did the right thing. And I think this is the wrong time for the sort of what I would call populist demagogues to basically be coming out saying that we shouldn't protect deposits. Okay, I know it's an easy way to score political points,
it's actually
but
not
we must save the banking
points.
system.
It's actually to the contrary. I can tell you the number of people that told me they would in Silicon Valley would be donors that are not donors, that are mega donors, which is why a lot of Republicans actually aren't coming out and taking the stance that I am, because their incentives with their donor class actually keep them in their place. But I'm just speaking my mind, David, and I'm not blaming the venture capitalists, but I do think it's important that people understand the incentives of the people they hear from. And the financial incentives, it would be malpractice not to point out that from you to Mark Cuban to anybody else, had personal financial incentives to make sure Silicon Valley depositors are saved, so they can at least understand when they're evaluating an argument about a national bank run, what prism they see that through, which I think is fair game. I think you would agree with that.
Sherry from Omaha, Nebraska has this to say about Genucel. I have sensitive skin and I am careful about all products. Then my husband bought me Genucel's immediate effects product and Genucel deep firming serum. Felt it working immediately. Eyes look amazing, face feels smooth, and it diminished the appearance of wrinkles. So impressed, and thanks to Genucel and my husband, I take Genucel everywhere. It's not just Sherry. As you know, Genucel has sold over 1 million products to women and men across this great country of ours. Say goodbye to fine lines, wrinkles, and even those annoying under-eye bags and puffiness from years of endless Zoom calls. And look 5, 10, even 15 years younger, just in time for the warmer weather. Best of all, guaranteed results in as little as 12 hours or your money back. Go to jennycell.com to see for yourself with 70% off their most popular package right now. All their best stuff, including the classic under-eye bags and puffiness treatment. Free shipping and luxury beauty box containing 2 free gifts with every subscription. Go to jennycell.com/MK60. GENUCEL.com/MK60. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.